Today, President Donald Trump is attacking Ukrainian President Zelensky on social media, falsely calling him a dictator without elections, saying that Zelensky has done a terrible job and claiming that Ukraine is shattered. Now, this comes after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine is not for sale and that Donald Trump is in a disinformation bubble. His comments followed President Trump's comments that when he erroneously blamed Ukraine for starting the war with Russia in that Fox interviews last night. Have a listen.
And I think I have the power to end this war. And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way.
All right, joining us now is New York Times chief White House reporter Peter Baker. Hi, Peter. And Michael Allen is here with us in studio, former special assistant to President George W. Bush. He's now the managing director for Beacon Global Strategies. Peter, I want to start with you. First of all, I was an election monitor in Ukraine during Zelensky's election. I can promise you he was, in fact, elected. And as far as we knew at the time, there were no irregularities or anything else. But I also want to ask you, President Trump is making these kind of head-spinning allegations against Ukrainian President Zelensky after Zelensky said he's in a disinformation bubble. What is Trump's goal here? Is he just trying to lean into and kind of double down on what he's said? Where do you go with this?
Well, I'm glad to hear that you were there and that you could tell us about that election. That's important. It's remarkable, of course, to hear an American president talk about an ally the way he's talking about Volodymyr Zelensky, whereas he says nothing about Vladimir Putin, who actually is a dictator, who actually does have manipulated elections that are not democratic, who actually is the one who launched the invasion, full-scale invasion 30 years ago. Trump said yesterday, you started it, meaning the Ukrainians. Of course they did not start it. He said today that Zelensky tricked the United States into giving him $350 billion to go to war. Obviously not true. And what's remarkable about it, of course, is we've never seen anything like this from an American president. And what is his goal? He has had a thing about Ukraine going back years. He was convinced that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election against him. That's a Russian talking point, but it's one that he has accepted. And he has been, therefore, had antipathy toward Ukraine ever since. It was part of his first impeachment back in 2018 and 19, or sorry, 2019 and 20. And I think that that's just his head has always been in a negative space towards Ukraine and in a positive space towards Putin.
The other thing that's kind of remarkable about this is he's not only going against established fact, he's going against U.S. intelligence. Because if you remember, it was U.S. intelligence that was warning at the Munich Security Conference 3 years ago, Russia is going to invade, Russia is planning to invade. And it was the Europeans and the Ukrainians who kind of didn't believe it until all of a sudden it happened. So we also have NBC News is reporting that U.S. intelligence U.S. intelligence shows Putin isn't really interested in a peace deal right now, and he still wants to control all of Ukraine. So you've got Putin coming out today and saying he's ready to return to the negotiating table, and he'd be happy to meet President Trump. But how can anyone trust him? I know the Ukrainians don't. Should the Americans?
Well, I think the Ukrainians ought to take a deep breath here. This is Trump, the real estate developer, jawboning a party to an eventual transaction. It's not a style we're used to, but it is Trump's way. Keith Kellogg is in Ukraine. If I were Zelensky, I would send a message back to President Trump through him about the types of things that he might be able to agree to in an eventual negotiation. On Putin's recalcitrance, it's going to happen. It will appear and rear its head at some point in these negotiations, and the worm will turn, and Trump will begin to criticize Putin more harshly to condition him to come to the table. But you
don't think this altruistic, diplomatic Putin is going to last through the second or third phase of these negotiations?
I don't think so, because I can't imagine any scenario where we really arrest the root causes of what caused this war. I don't believe, even if Trump is not in a great place on Zelensky, that he wants to totally sell Ukraine out. And that's ultimately what Putin wants, a Ukraine that doesn't exist.
Peter, I also want to get your take on this meeting between Secretary Rubio and Lavrov yesterday in Saudi Arabia. First of all, where has Lavrov been? I feel like he was out of favor for a while, and now all of a sudden he's back center stage in this very high-profile negotiation. But they came out of that room without having any European or Ukrainian input. And can there be an end to the war without one of the parties involved in the war in the room? Is it even remotely possible?
Well, what you hear, of course, is a disconnect, right? Rubio says, look, of course, we're going to consult with the Europeans. Of course, we're going to consult with the Ukrainians. In fact, he called a number of European foreign ministers shortly after his meeting with Lavrov in Saudi Arabia. But you're right. It was a big deal that the Ukrainians felt so left out. President Zelensky was planning to go to Saudi Arabia and then told basically that he wasn't welcome and didn't end up making the trip. Meanwhile, even as Rubio is trying to reassure people, yes, of course, we're going to do this in concert with our allies, you hear Trump say yesterday, no, they don't deserve a seat at the table, meaning the Ukrainians, because they started the war and they didn't make a deal over the last 3 years. What deal should they have made over the last 3 years? A deal that would surrender their territory. And that's what he wants them to do. So he's putting a lot of pressure on Zelensky. He's making clear that whatever deal he makes with Putin is what he thinks it should be, not necessarily what Zelensky thinks it will be. And it's left the Europeans on the sideline trying to figure out what their play is.
Yeah, Peter, I also want to ask you about your article today in the Times. You write, Mr. Trump is in the middle of executing one of the most jaw-dropping pivots in American foreign policy in generations, a 180-degree turn that will force friends and foes to recalibrate in fundamental ways. You know, I just came back from Munich, where this was completely on display, to the point where I was told in one meeting, leaders just kind of went on with their planned speeches about American-European friendship because they didn't really know what else to do. What message is the U.S. sending to our allies right now?
Well, I think the message is that we're in the middle of what we've been calling a new Cold War, and it looks like America may be switching sides. I mean, Trump obviously says and favors the points that the Kremlin has put out there. The concessions that he has floated for any peace talks have been exactly what the Kremlin wants, which is to say sanctions are lifted. He gets to keep all the territory he illegally seized by force. Ukraine doesn't get any security guarantees, much less NATO membership from the United States. Trump is even floating the idea of readmitting Russia into the G7, which, of course, the rest of the G7 would not want to do. Meanwhile, the Europeans, what they're hearing from Washington is, you're a bunch of bad partners. You're free riders. You're not spending enough on your military. We don't think you're fair to us on trade. We're going to slap tariffs on you. We think you're too mean to the neo-Nazi party in Germany. That's the message.
Sorry, Peter, I think we lost you there for a sec. Can you hear us?
Yeah,
sorry, you were saying, you said that's the message that you think Trump is sending right now?
Yeah, the message that Trump is sending to the European allies is he doesn't think much of you. He doesn't particularly care about being in NATO. In fact, he covets the territory of some of our NATO partners, including Canada, which he says he wants to make the 51st state, in Greenland, which is affiliated with Denmark. So right now it's a period of great tension and a big rift growing potentially with the European allies. At the same time, Trump is siding up to Putin's view of Ukraine.
Yeah, I actually asked the Canadian Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, about red, white, and blue land in Greenland, and she pushed back very astutely and said, this is not a joke. Yeah. And I said, no, it's not. I want to ask you, Michael, talking to leaders in Europe, they still have a consensus on Ukraine. Yeah. They still have a consensus on supporting Ukraine. Where there's fear is that they do not have a consensus with how to deal with what Peter was just talking about, how to negotiate, how to navigate this new confrontational America. And there's a concern that as allies take a different tactic, some may choose to be obsequious, some may choose to be confrontational, some may try to stay neutral. That approach in itself could fracture the European alliance. Not so much the issue of Ukraine, but they could be less effective if they're all fighting over how to deal with Trump. What's your take on that?
Well, they need unity here. Yeah. And I think that's what Trump smells in them. They got together Monday, the day after the Munich Security Conference, and didn't really have anything to come out and say. If I'm Europe, and I'm faced with the news of this tweet today and digesting everything happened in the weekend, they need to put something on the table. They need to come out and say, we'll have 50,000 European troops as part of a peacekeeping force eventually, as long as we have some American involvement in the end. Or here's a brand new plan to fund Ukraine. Or here's one of the weapon systems that we're going to develop a comparative advantage in and fund this for Ukraine into the future. Right now, they're just kind of running around. No one knows where they are. They want a seat at the table, but I think you can't beat something with nothing. They need something to bring to Trump, and that might impress Trump, and Trump might bring him in then.
I want to show you, we have some new images coming in. This is Keith Kellogg being greeted by the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine in Kyiv. You know, we were just talking about what message President Zelensky should send through Kellogg. What message should Europe send? Could this possibly have a backlash? Because if you remember, Putin's approach to this was to try to fracture NATO. It actually made NATO stronger, and it gained it 2 new members, Finland and Sweden. Could Trump's criticism of Europe have the same effect? Could we see the EU do those exact things you were just talking about because they feel like they really have to? I
think privately, a lot of people in the White House are glad of the messages that they sent this weekend because it does catalyze the Europeans to a degree. They need to come up with something tangible, as I said, but I think they're on notice that things have fundamentally changed with Trump in office. They need to start putting things on the table, and that's the way they respond to Trump. That's the way they buy themselves a seat into these international negotiations. I don't think it's enough to just say, I used to be a world power, I ought to be at the table. I think they got to come in with something.
Put up.
That's right.
All right, Peter Baker and Michael Allen, thank you both so much.
Thank you.